Good morning, girls. Today we will discuss the poet W.H. Auden. So, as you know, we started with modernism and have already discussed two poets. One was T.S. Eliot and the other one was W.B. Yeats. Today we will discuss the poetic career of W.H. Auden. So, he belonged to this poets of the 30s. So, poets of the 30s are actually a group of young poets who emerged during the late 20s and early 30s, and their concerns were mainly to bring about a social change. And the key figure was W.H. Auden, who was influenced by Thomas Hardy, Edward Thomas, Wilfred Owen, and T.S. Eliot. It was this W.H. Auden who was preeminent among his Oxford contemporaries. We have Spender, De Lewis, Macnish, etc. And he won their admiration by his epigrammatic crispness of tone, his conversational manner, we'll discuss it in detail, and skillful control of phrase and meter. So he is the one who belonged to the poets of the 30s, but he became the poet of the century. So this is W.H. Auden, Winston Hugh Auden. He was born in New York and bred in Midlands and later settled in New York and took United States citizenship later. And as I said earlier, his early works seem to put him close to the Marxist camp. So they were influenced by the Marxist ideas, and almost all these poets, as I said earlier, recognized in Marxist condemnation of social injustice, a judgment on social injustice. So they were greatly influenced by Marxist ideals. So all of the Auden's early work is close to the Marxist camp. And most writers between the wars displayed a certain kind of engagement with issues of the time. In the 1930s, there was this political commitment became more noticeable as part of creative writing. They had this political commitment which they expressed through their poetry. And we see, especially we see these concerns in the poetry of Auden too. And W.H. Auden's engagement with the issues of the time. So this is a these are the lines from a poem written by W.H. Auden titled Consider. Consider this and in our time, as the hawk sees it, or the helmeted airman. These lines from the poem Consider by W.H. Auden, which was published in 1930, characterize much of the writings which came in the 1930s. The word itself, consider, is in, as you know, when you take the grammar, it is in the imperative form. It addresses the reader directly and proposes to take an action or at least invite some thought before any action is taken. And here the poet is stressing the present and asking us to consider this. That is something which is close to us. And we also consider something which is contemporary and in our time. So Auden is actually inviting us to see more clearly what is taking place before our own eyes. And one of the main European political events of The 1930s, which drew a response from these writers of this period, was this Spanish Civil War. It is the war event which influenced a generation of writers, Spanish Civil War. They felt that its outcome would shape the future, particularly since a Second World War seemed very close, very near. And it was in 1937 Auden wrote a poem entitled Spain. And in this poem, he sees the war as a battle between good and evil forces. The forces of the evil are associated with fascism and the regime of the dictator General Franco, and the forces of good are associated with the Republican Army, which had the support of the majority of the ordinary people of Spain. And look at these lines. Tomorrow, the rediscovery of romantic love, the photographing of ravens, all the fun under liberty's masterful shadow. Tomorrow, the eager election of chairman by a sudden forest of hands, but today the struggle. So Auden stresses the importance of the struggle today because it affects the future tomorrow. Auden saw the struggle for Spain as a political struggle, and victory would ensure that democracy. You see the word election by voting with a show of hands. So victory would ensure that democracy prevailed. But he also saw a struggle between opposing moral and psychological forces too, with one side representing negative feelings and the other side a positive democracy of feeling, which is the heart of all human action. So there is this physical struggle, and he talks about that struggle between the moral and psychological forces too. So his poem represented the concerns of the times and gave it a pictorial representation through all those symbols. And now we move to the characteristics of Auden's poetry. It is said that his technical versatility and virtuosity are immense, and moreover, he is irresistibly readable. We see an engaging fluency taking possession of the reader, and it is one half of the secret of Auden's compulsion. And the other half is his uncanny memorability. As I said earlier, he had this gift of epigrammatic conversationalism, which blended with casual and the contrived, vulgar and the literary, and which was juxtapositioned that prove inevitable against all laws of predictability. And in poems of direct approach, Auden actually makes you feel that you are in his presence, but not that you know him well. He is not remarkable for his self revelation or for transference onto paper of what sharply felt in human relationships, but his voice is always a poet's voice, a poet who is in love with words. And Auden always rejected the prophet stance. He doesn't talk from the standpoint of a prophet. He doesn't instruct or he doesn't buttonhole the reader. The take it or leave it air. That kind of attitude is what you see in W.H. Auden's poetry. Take it or leave it. So it does not mean that there is this lack of concern, but he maintains a healthy sense of proportion. And sometimes the reader finds himself eavesdropping as a modest practitioner who thinks aloud. And now there is this comparison between T.S. Eliot or 20s versus W.H. Auden. or 30s. So there is this comparison between the poetic style of Eliot and Auden, or in general, you can say that it's a comparison between the poets of the 20s to the 30s. So Eliot's poetry explores a private condition, while Auden's poetry explores a more public situation. Eliot is searching primarily for spiritual solutions, as you see in his poetry, and Auden is stressing that our private worlds cannot be separated from social and political context. And T.S. Eliot uses form and language which embody the confusions and complexities of individual identity in the modern world. And as a result, when we discussed T.S. Eliot, we knew that his poetry is often obscure and difficult for common people. While W.H. Auden during this period uses form and language to communicate a more social perspective on the modern world. And as a result, his poetry is more accessible and more popular. However, both Auden and Eliot share the same poetic quest. They had this same poetic quest, poetic journey towards meaning of life amidst images of contemporary world which fail to give out a coherent, a united whole. And now we talk about the Auden Group of 30s. Although W.H. Auden's poetic voice was powerful and influential throughout the 1930s, there are many other writers who responded to the events of that decade with equal energy and commitment. They also considered this, as you see in the poem, consider. They also considered this and in our time, and their writing too fused with the private and public worlds, attempting to win a wider readership. There were a number of poets who belonged to Auden Group who developed a style and viewpoint similar to W.H. Auden. Now, as I said earlier, most important members of this group include Louis MacNeice, Cecil Day Lewis, and Stephen Spender. So their poetry is diverse, but there is again a focus on social themes and a use of clear, ordinary language and popular forms. So their poems addressed the issues of the time. They had this influence of the Marxist ideals. Their poetry directly addressed the issues of the time, and yet it remained clearly accessible, and it got wider readership. When you compare it with the poets of the 20s, you have T.S. Eliot, etc. And at the end, we see there is this element of disillusionment entering into their poetry. So at the end of the 1930s, all these poets looked back on the decade and tried to evaluate the rapid and radical changes that had actually taken place. And there is this poem, 1st September 1939, which was written by W.H. Auden. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. So here we see that Auden is somewhat disillusioned, and later he emigrated to America. That is why I told in the introduction that he gained this US citizenship. And during the following 30 years, his poetry became more personal and more spiritual. And it also came to reflect a belief that poetry cannot by itself create a better world, even when it attempts to communicate with wide reading public. So he had this disappointment, disillusionment at the end of his poetic career. And there is this conclusion which Auden reached at the end of the 1930s. And He put it in one of his famous poems in memory of W.B. Yeats that poetry makes nothing happen. So here ends the poetic career of W.H. Auden. So we have finished our modernist poets. Please make notes out of these lectures. If you have any doubts, please contact me. And this is also, you must consider that this is the decade that began with consider, and there is this need to alert readers of poetry to immediate contemporary events, which ended with a message that poetry cannot really influence things. And as I said earlier, this is a departure from England to America. It's actually symbolized this change of attitude from commitment to withdrawal. So here ends. Thank you, girls. Have a nice day.